TopMedTalk.
Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. This podcast is called At the TopMedTalk Table, and it's a series of conversations which we had at the TopMedTalk table when we were in attendance at the World Prehabilitation Conference in London. We've got a couple of conversations on the way. We're going to be hearing about the mechanism behind prehabilitation. But before that, let's have a conversation about shared decision making.
Hi, my name's Imogen Fecher-Jones. Up until very recently, I was a lead nurse for perioperative medicine at Southampton, and I'm lucky enough to be able to be on a funded clinical fellowship to do some work around perioperative medicine and patient education pre-surgery. But I was very much involved when we set up our shared decision-making service in Southampton in 2018, and continue to support the team with some data collection and analysis at the moment. I'm here today to share our work. So lucky enough to make the final with my abstract that we submitted about our shared decision-making work. I think from what I've seen is that although this was an evaluation of a service and not research by any stretch of imagination, it presents something quite new about a group of patients that we know very little about, in that patients that have a shared decision-making consultation and then decide not to have surgery as a result, and what happens to those patients and whether or not they regret the choices that they've made. We collected data on all of the patients that attended our shared decision-making consultation, and these are very high-risk patients. So we run shared decision-making across the board at Southampton, but we particularly put extra resource into our highest-risk patients because those are the ones we know are going to be resource-intensive and are likely to have problems, and where the risk may outweigh the benefits of having surgery. So we follow them all up after their consultation and look at quality of life as well as whether or not they felt they'd made the right decision. And reassuringly, although it's early days with the data, it looks like the patients that are choosing not to have these operations, and in some cases majority of cases these are cancer surgeries, actually, don't regret the decision that they've made and are not particularly worse off in relation to quality of life at 6 months after they've made that decision, which I think most people are surprised about. I think the thing about shared decision-making is it's all about the patient's preferences and values and what is actually important to them, and really understanding that, because sitting there as clinicians, we want to make that patient better or give them the best chance of living a longer life, but actually having surgery for that particular patient who is very high risk, that might not be the way to having that dignified end of life pathway, perhaps. Anyway, some of these patients aren't going to live more than a few years after their surgery, and they want to be able to do that in the best possible way. Having an operation they might never recover from is not necessarily what they want to do. When you really talk to them about that and the trajectory of their recovery, it's quite illuminating what's important to patients. So, as I said at the start, I was involved in setting up these clinics. I don't run these clinics. I don't see these patients on a day-to-day basis, but I do follow them up. And where you're getting patients that have been on a waiting list already for 6 months, and in their head, they're having an operation, and then they come to a clinic and someone says, well, have you looked at how you're going to be recovering? Actually, it doesn't look like a great picture. And with all this detail to hand and your risk levels, do you still want to have that operation? They're like, well, no, I'm having an operation. It's like they'd already made their mind up before they came in, and it's quite difficult then to sway them on that, actually, rightly or wrongly. But more often we're getting really early referrals where actually surgery isn't a definite, it's an option. And so you're laying out all of the options available to them, and they'll pick the one that feels the best for them. So I feel that the patients are walking away with something, at least. I mean, their heads are up in the air. They have lots of questions. You follow them up a week later. Many of them still have questions and still can't make the decision and need more time. It's about patients' expectations, I suppose, what's going to happen in the clinic and what their expectations when they arrive, whether they already think they're having an operation or not. From an NHS point of view, if someone turns around and says they don't want an operation, and they're not going to have all those complications they would have had, we're like, great, brilliant. It's in the patients made that choice. It's in their interest, and we've saved a whole lot of money. But I can see a completely different perspective on the other side of the Atlantic. Talked to a few people just in the last 24 hours about it, because I hadn't really sat back and perceived it from the international perspective, because that's, potentially money lost. And then it's really difficult, isn't it, to think about how that might sway some of the decision-making conversation, how it runs really with the patient. I came from being a surgical nurse, and I'm just so I got so enthusiastic about the fact that working on this small group of preoperative patients, not just high-risk ones, but our whole referral who gets referred to us, and working on their comorbidities and their areas of modifiable risk, and how then that could be applied for the rest of their life. And all the things that we're learning about how to get people to change behaviours and modify their lifestyle, that can be applied to any patient on, not just surgical patients, anyone we're having, an interface with within the healthcare system. So I think it's one big package, isn't it? And we're just seeing a small proportion of them, but everything we're learning can totally be applied across the board, I think. Any interaction with a health service at any point is a teachable moment, not just surgery. But there is that argument that when you say to someone, right, you need to go under the knife, that's suddenly going to motivate them into action. Actually, I think the evidence is that's not necessarily the case. There will be a few that are scared into action. But actually, it's then giving them the tools and the right interventions to be able to really, they're a bit motivated at that point, but they've still got to have the capability and the opportunity. And we've talked a little bit about that at this conference. So then go ahead and make that behavior change to change their lifestyle and for it to make a difference in their recovery. COVID has given us a podium and a spotlight, actually, because all of a sudden we've got all of these patients and they're deteriorating by the day and they're coming in and they're just, we know that they're doing worse because they've been at home and they've deconditioned and those waiting lists are so long. And it's what do we do with those? And all of a sudden, well, we've all got this package that's been working quietly in the background and, well, why don't we upscale it massively? So we've been lucky to have investment because of COVID and our organisation seeing that actually now's the time for this to happen. So, I think we definitely would have got there anyway, but I do feel that COVID gave us that little extra push that's really, really helped.
Hi, I'm Nick Tetlow. I'm an exercise physiologist at UCLH. I'm also an honorary research fellow at UCL, and I'm involved in the Human Physiology and Performance Lab. So looking at exploring the mechanisms behind why some patients develop complications and why others don't. It's been an amazing past couple of days. There's a whole host of amazing information coming, not just from the UK, but also a big representation from abroad, which is amazing to see some of the work that's being done, some of the collaborations that's being done, not just from the kind of major centres, but also filtering down into like local hospitals, local trusts, and how they're starting to develop pathways, develop pieces of information technology to help, for example, wearables, and how that's really going to help propel kind of the world of perioperative medicine. I've put together an abstract looking at metabolic inflexibility and how that may be associated with the development of morbidity, but also how that may also impact long-term outcomes. So survival at long-term, as in 5 years, but also at 1 year. There's some literature in the sporting background, which is my background. I'm an exercise physiologist, but in the perioperative space, it's something that's not been explored. So it's quite an emerging field. It could be one of the underlying mechanisms why patients develop complications. We know that in general, patients are aerobically unfit. So that means that they have a cellular limitation. They are unable to generate energy. And an inability to generate energy during exercise may also mean that they have an inability to generate energy for things like post-operatively healing, get out of bed, mobilize, etc. So what we've looked at is there's a lot of literature that shows that fitness is associated with outcomes, but we don't exactly understand why. Is it immune function? Is it cellular function? Is it cardiovascular function? And there's lots of different hypotheses. But what we know is that when we look at patients that are exercise trained, so things like elite athletes, and when we compare those to the exercise untrained, i.e. the perioperative patient, the untrained individuals seem to be limited by the ability to generate energy at the cellular level. So it's right down at the mitochondria. That's the bit that limits them, rather than being able to send blood or oxygen to the tissue. And that means that if we can identify that cellular limitation, we may be able to intervene with things like nutrition or pharmacotherapy or specific exercise that's tailored to the individual to be able to increase the way they use fat, increase the way they use carbohydrate, and then improve their ability to regulate their body's response to your surgical stressor, but also then healing post-operatively. So we've looked at a small group of patients as a pilot study. Last year, we looked at patients that do develop complications and patients that don't develop complications. And what we found is that when we look at a big group of individuals, some patients use fuel differently. And the ones that tend to have complications have an inability to use fat and carbohydrate, whereas the patients that don't develop complications, they can increase the amount of fat they use when they are hit with an external stressor. And the way we mimic that in the lab is through cardiopulmonary exercise testing. So a patient cycles and we measure how much fat they use, how much carbohydrate they use, and how they generate energy. And this year we've put some data together, which is around about 85 patients. It's a pilot study. And we've looked at a group of patients and we've shown that regardless of who does and doesn't develop complications, fitness doesn't appear to be different. So patients are equally fit, but there's a big clear difference in the amount that they use carbohydrates. And that may mean that actually potentially explain why some patients who are fit and have great surgery and other patients are fit and then suffer from a complication. In terms of the future, identifying this target is something that's important. We don't yet know how we can modify it, although there is literature to say that if you do certain types of exercise or you have certain dietary supplementation, that you can change the way your body metabolizes fuel. And that may help patients in the post-operative period, as in understanding what their caloric needs are, but also the caloric breakdown. So understanding, is it fat, is it carbohydrate, but also how much fat, how much carbohydrate, how much protein, and then being able to tailor that nutrition post-operatively to hopefully improve their recovery, get them back to baseline, and then improve things like long-term quality of life and survival. A lot of patients have routine cardiopulmonary exercise testing, and it's very easy during that CPET test to understand how they utilize fuel in response to a stressor. And from that point, we can then start to tailor things, and we can tailor it a personalized way. So understanding what we can give the patient to not just improve their fitness, but also improve their metabolism. And then that's going to support the entire continuum of perioperative care. So right from the early point of they're in the CPET clinic, they're having a fitness assessment and we discuss risks, right the way through prehabilitation, exercise, nutrition, etc. And then right the way through to surgery and recovering from surgery, and then long-term care afterwards as well. The easiest way to contextualize this is the analogy of a hybrid car. So effectively, when you use petrol or diesel, that provides rapid energy really quickly. And that's a bit like burning glucose or carbohydrates. You get high energy in a very quick way. But that's not very efficient. Whereas when you use the electric battery in a car, it's a bit like burning fat. You can produce energy for a very long period of time. It's sustained, it's clean, but that's at a much lower intensity. So therefore, when you exercise at low intensity, you predominantly use fat to produce energy through the mitochondria, and that's called aerobic metabolism. And when we increase the intensity of work, you then tend to work a little bit anaerobically. Without oxygen, you burn glucose. So what we think, but again, there's further evidence needed, is that when we apply exercise that has intervals that goes below and above those thresholds, we're not just training our body at getting stronger and our cardiovascular system, but we're also improving our body's ability to go from one fuel source to the other fuel source. And that allows us to become more metabolically flexible. So you can take a form of interval training where you have, for example, 2 minutes of high intensity and then 3 minutes of low intensity. And if we prescribe those 2 minutes of high intensity at an intensity where you're predominantly burning carbohydrates, then your body's going to have to use carbohydrates to produce that energy. And then when we reduce the intensity down, your body will realize that it doesn't have to produce energy as quickly, as rapidly. And therefore it will switch back, hopefully, in a healthy individual, switch back to utilizing fat. And if we repeat that process several times, we can hopefully train our body's ability to change its fuel source when we have different stressors. And that's a little bit how we kind of model the surgical stress response. Is we have surgery, it's a big stress for the body, and we've got to heal, we've got to create processes in our body that help that healing process. And by switching fuels, we can hopefully train our body to be able to utilize the right fuel at the right time and give the patient the best possible chance of recovering. Metabolic flexibility is affected by other things as well. So it'll be affected by your immune state, it'll be affected by your lifestyle, certain disease conditions, and that interaction is something that we need to explore. It's something that's quite complex, but also in the same way, if we improve other things, that may improve your metabolic flexibility. And if we improve your metabolic flexibility, that's likely to have an impact on other things like your immune function and other important aspects in the perioperative care pathway. The way your body uses fuel also reflects your metabolism and your immune function. And we know that immune cells behave differently in different environments. So if you have a very anaerobic environment, lots of glucose, then you tend to have impaired immune function. Whereas if you have your immune cells working in a more anaerobic manner, a lower glucose concentration, your immune cells work better. And that may have a whole host of implications, and it's been spoken about today at the conference, is how that may implicate in terms of tumor regression and also tumor burden. There's a lot of implications for health and disease. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have a system where we're quite reactive. But as we move forward and we advance, hopefully we can have a bit more proactive care. So looking at things like government initiatives a lot earlier on to hopefully reduce some of the burden that is being experienced at the moment and also will be experienced in the future. Some of the work that we've done in our lab also has shown the massive impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had. There's been a massive decrease in patient fitness. And we know that fitness is associated with outcomes. We know it's associated with longer term, the amount of care that's needed. And that is going to have to be addressed at some point, whether it's now or it's 10 years down the line. But that impact of that pandemic will have an effect.
TopMedTalk.
Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.